With the power of Tandem HR, you are in the fast lane on Main Street with Get Down to Business with Shalom Klein, the show for business and jobs. Now, the champion of networking, the advocate of jobs, the guru of business, your host, Shalom Klein.
William Shakespeare once said, "We know what we are, but know not what we may be." We are all about small business, jobs, and entrepreneurship. And business, we talk a lot about business here. You're on with Get Down to Business, and I'm your host, Shalom Klein. Remember, you can always download podcasts from Get Down to Business on my website at shalomklein.com. And while you are there, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Shalom Klein. As always, it's going to be a jam-packed week of content and information you won't want to miss. We're going to be sharing tips, advice, and all sorts of information about networking and business that you won't want to miss. This week, we're thrilled that we're going to be joined first by John Figiel of Tandem HR. John has joined us in the past on the show, and I know our listeners are in for a real treat. So, John, welcome to Get Down to Business. You know, business owners have a lot to think about. One of the things that most business owners, I can't speak for all, don't think about enough is leadership change and planning for the future. John, do you have a secret recipe for that?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me back, Shalom. It's good to see you again. There is no secret recipe, but like anything in business, there's formulas and there's models and there's methods. And I think what managers and leaders need to think about are a couple of things. One is, what's the scope of change? Is this a big change or a little change? And most of the time, leaders think about actually implementing the change itself, whether it's putting in a new technology or implementing a new benefit plan. But what they don't think about is the people part of it. And so that's the second thing. How does this affect people, and how does it impact the individuals that the change is targeted toward? So that's a key piece. The
term that is often tossed around is strategic planning. Is that what you're referring to, or is that something else?
Strategic planning is part of change, but I'm thinking more about and talking more about once you have a plan in place, you need a plan to implement that change, and then how it's going to affect the people who are supposed to be delivering that change.
And is it from top to bottom? Meaning, is this just something that executives need to worry about in the C-suite, or is this something that really you need to think about the change that's going to happen on the line staff and the people that are actually doing the job of the company as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. It impacts all three levels. The top level, because they're the ones planning the change and implementing change. Middle managers are the ones who are actually the ones who are activating it. There's an old saying that change is where it goes to die at middle management level. And then the individuals are the ones who are actually going to be impacted by it. So you have to think about all three levels.
This sounds like a really difficult conversation to have. A company is grown often by a handful of people that have a vision, have an idea. And, you know, bottom line, we're all people. We all have a little bit of an ego, and we all believe that we are right for the most part. How is it possible that an entrepreneur can think that maybe it's time to do things a little bit differently? How does that conversation start?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is if they have a vision and a plan for where they want to go, and then they can estimate what's the gap between where they are and where they want to be. That's the first step. The second thing is always get outside advice. Always be thinking about who can I talk to who's outside my business? What other resources can I be looking at that can help me think about my organization differently? And that'll give you some good ideas about where you're doing well and what you need to do to change.
We're talking with John Figiel of Tandem HR. John, when we started the conversation, we said two terms, planning and leadership change. Leadership change, are you suggesting that a CEO of a company needs to think about the future after themselves?
Yes. That's a hard conversation to have with the CEO, particularly if they're a founder of an organization. But that's when, if an individual wants to think about, what is my legacy and where do I want this business to be after I leave the organization, they need to start thinking about succession, who's going to replace me, as well as where is this organization going to go.
So you work with a lot of companies and with a lot of professionals. What is the typical timeline? How long after a company starts should a conversation like this be taking place?
Well, usually when you think about the life cycle of an organization, there's the starting point, which organizations are just trying to survive. They're just trying to get started. And once they meet that plateau, then they need to start thinking about, now, how do we stabilize? And then how do we get to the next level? So really, after 18 months, 2 years is the first time to start thinking about change. then maybe after 3 or 5 years. And then once they've really grown, they need to be thinking about it on an annual basis.
That's fascinating. So I view myself, everybody has their strengths and their weaknesses. Picking on myself for a moment, I view myself, I'm strong in marketing. Listen, we're on the radio together right now. I know that is my strength, but is it a normal culture in an organization or in a company that people are cross-trained? And what are the best practices that our listeners should know about making sure that people can perform each other's duties?
Yeah, that's a great point, Shalom, because that is really what's going to build the capability of your team to implement any change that's in place. So one is, first of all, identify what are those skills that are required to be successful. Two, do an inventory. Find out where your strengths are, and once again, do that gap analysis about what's missing, and then start strategically thinking about what are the jobs and who are those people that need to start learning different skills so that if we lose a person, we can replace them.
Are these the steps that you take with your customers and clients at Tandem?
Well, these are the types of things that we talk about with them. Every organization is different. They're at different places on that change curve, if you will. And so what we try to do is customize our solutions to meet wherever they are. But yeah, these are the basic principles around good, effective change.
So if you can, I know our listeners love to hear examples, love to hear success stories, or perhaps even stories of nightmares and terror when things like this are not done properly. Can you enlighten us about an organization, feel free to use names or not use names, that did this successfully and maybe one that hasn't?
Well, I can give an example of, I like to focus on the positive, so I'll give an example of where it's successful. I won't name names. This organization was looking at how are they going to do a better job of onboarding their employees. And so they'd spent a lot of time designing a new employee orientation and onboarding program, and they thought they were done. And what they did is they started sending out emails and implementing the new processes, but what they didn't do is really communicate to folks what's changed, what's different, and really what's in it for you. And so that was an example where they stumbled. Now, the good side of that story is they were always getting feedback from their employees about how the implementation was going, and they learned very quickly that it wasn't working well. So they quickly readjusted, which is another key element of change. Always get constant feedback and be willing to make adjustments along the way. They started communicating more effectively. They started giving people more information and getting employees involved in the change process, because that's a key element as well. I like to use a formula, participation equals ownership. When people participate in the change, they own the change, and then it's going to be more successful. So
for a decent-sized company, a company over 100 people, how would you recommend that a CEO involve even the line staff in that change process?
I think there's three things. First of all, be very clear about what's changing and then what's not changing. Because as soon as you start implementing change, people get nervous. They start thinking about, big change. How's this going to affect my job, et cetera. So what's changing, what's not changing. Be very clear about the vision, where are we going, and the path to get there. And then the third part, the participation piece, set up opportunities for people to give their ideas. It could be group meetings, it could be lunches, but it could be sending an email, but give them opportunities to give their input into how they view that change and how they can implement that change.
And you made a fascinating comment that this should not be a static document, something that just sits on a table, but it should actually be updated and it should be live and it should change over time. That's so important. So, John, we're slowly running out of time. I like to make the show a little bit fun. What's your favorite place to travel?
What's my favorite place to travel?
Yeah.
I love to go I've been to Maui once. And it was fantastic.
So all of our Maui listeners, if you have a organizational change question, I'm sure John would love to hear from you. He'd love to expense that. He'd love to turn it into a business trip. That's great. So John Figiel of Tandem HR, you really are a change and leadership expert. How can our listeners get a hold of you if they want to learn more and have that sort of difficult conversation?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from your listeners. The best way to get a hold of me is by email, which is jfiegel@tandemhr.com.
jfiegel@tandemhr.com. Tandem HR is your solution center. You can check them out online. They have blogs. They have information. tandemhr.com. Get a hold of them. Let them know that you heard about us on Get Down to Business. After the break, we're going to check in with executive business coach and Vistage chair Dick Smith. You won't want to miss a minute of it. John Figiel of Tandem HR. You've got a fantastic team of people in place. We appreciate your involvement. So tell us just for in the moment or two that we have remaining about the what's exciting at Tandem HR and the growth that's going on.
Yeah. So speaking of change, we have ourselves gone through tremendous growth. And as part of that, we've been putting some new processes in place and putting some new organization in place to help us not only manage the growth, but also create a platform for future growth. So we have ourselves experiencing a lot of change.
Well, great organization. Again, get in touch with John Figiel, jfigiel at tandemhr.com. And on their website, they have so many great resources. Until then, get on my website, shalomklein.com. That's where you can download podcasts from shows like today, hear more advice from people like John Figiel at Tandem HR, find out who's going to be on next week on the show that's all about small business, jobs, and entrepreneurship. I'm your host, Shalom Klein. You're listening to Get Down to Business. We're going to check in with Vistage Chair Executive Business Coach Dick Smith after the break. Don't touch that dial. You're listening to Get Down to Business.